Hi guys. This year, the winter in the Urals was especially severe. At last, a temperature is rising above -30 centigrade, which means the cameras, the lenses, the batteries are not freezing anymore, and the Berlioga channel is going back to the forest. We're very glad about it. We've been missing our forest shootings. While we were in our winter isolation, the world of knives has changed a lot, and one of the most discussed events was that the Beaver Knife Workshop, which is famous throughout the world for the high-quality knives with Scandi grind that's tapering down to zero, made a new product, a knife called Pointer. The blade has the geometry of a lance, or in other words, a convex grind. Today we're not going to be speaking about the Beaver knives per se, although we will be using their knives. We'll be making a bunch of tests to compare the Scandi grind and the convex grind, and we'll try to choose the best knife for the forest and for bushcrafting. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell button so you don't miss out on our new videos. Your support is very important to us. Did you do it? Okay, now let's go. We've chosen two knives for the tests. The Scandi grind will be represented by my favorite knife for the forest called Thorn. This custom make is called Shadow Edition. It's 3.7 millimeters thick, 138 thousandths of an inch, gauge 9 steel of the CPM 3V mark. The included blade angle is around 30 degrees. The pointer that will represent convex grind knives in our testing is made of the same kind of steel, which is also 3.7 millimeters thick. We're not going to pay too much attention to the other specifications and ergonomics of these knives. It's not so important for us today, because we'll be mostly comparing the geometry of the blades. And we should start with betoning. Betoning is when we're using a knife to cut logs, usually the smaller ones, but sometimes the big ones as well, with a knife. I'm often asked, why would we be cutting logs with a knife when you can always take an axe with you for it? The answer is actually very simple and plain to see. Most likely, you'll need an axe if you go on a long hiking trip with a relatively big number of people, where you need to process big quantities of wood. But if there's just two of you or you're alone, going to the forest for a day or two, there's no point in taking an axe for such a short hike. You'll definitely take a knife with you, and it should be enough. But I strongly recommend that you take a small folding saw with you, besides the knife. This minimal set of two items, in a lot of cases, will be much better than a knife. A good and properly chosen knife will be enough not just for cooking, but for all kinds of woodworking also. The only thing that's not so convenient to do with a knife is chopping up the trunk of a tree after you fell it, and that's when the saw comes in handy. And the best part is that the size and the weight of the set will be much smaller than the size and the weight of an axe. So let's get back to betoning. That's definitely where the Scandi grind is at its best. Your first step on the spine of the knife should be light, so that the cutting edge sink into the wood at a right angle, so that when you actually start betoning, there's no side load on the bevels of your blade. And after a few hits, your log is torn to pieces. Here's how the Scandi grind works. With the first few strikes, the knife gets into the wood as deep as its bevel goes, just cutting through it. And then the cheek, the flat part of the blade, gets into action. A Bushcraft knife is quite thick, in this case it's almost 4 millimeters thick, and thanks to this thickness, it starts nicely splitting up the wood. The bevel cuts, while the cheeks help split the wood. It's almost a real axe. The Convex works a little differently. Since the whole blade is shaped like a lance, tapering down to the cutting edge, the load falls on the edge only in the very beginning. Then the knife enters the log and the edge is cutting it just a little bit, while the wood glides down the lance to the spine. And with each millimeter of this gliding, the wood opens more and more. It doesn't split apart like when you're using the Scandi grind. It actually feels more like cutting, from the first batoning motion to the last one. And the best part of it is that it's not actually cutting. What's working here is the geometry of the blade, and the load on the cutting edge is minimal, so the knife stays sharp longer. When you're working with wood, quite often you need to do some precision work that requires fine control of the cut. One of the examples of such work is shaving the wood to start a fire with a so-called fire feather. This kind of kindling may be useful, for example, in a damp forest. When everything around you is wet, it may not be easy to set some twigs on fire. But a log taken out of a dead standing tree may be wet on the outside but dry inside. So the trick here is to make the shaving really thin so that it could catch a fire from even a small bunch of sparks. That's where the Scandi grind knife also shines. It works like a carpenter's plane. You just put the bevel flush to the wood, lift it up a tiny bit to increase the angle and start shaving it. Don't forget to carefully control the cut, and the knife will do all the work for you. Of course, you'll need to get some training to get accustomed to the angle of your knife's bevel, but it won't take a lot of time. It gets a little harder with the convex grind. The geometry of the blade is uneven, and it will be quite difficult to preserve the angle of shaving through the whole cut. Of course, everything takes practice and training, and in time you'll get used to any kind of knife you own. But the Scandi grind knife with a single bevel that tapers down to zero is just made for this kind of work, so it'll be much more pleasant to use here. When you're done with the kindling, all you need to do is get some sparks out of your fire steel, and your little bonfire is ready. You can do it with absolutely any kind of knife. The important thing is that it has a flat spine with sharp angles. And foreseeing your question, why can't I use just matches or a lighter? I'll answer, of course you can. And you should. But the fire steel is more reliable. The matches may get wet, the gas may get frozen, but the fire steel will never let you down. It will work when it's wet or even when it's broken into two halves. Now that we're done with precise cutting, it's time for something more rigorous. Which knife can gnaw on wood more aggressively? Which geometry is better suited for it? This kind of slicing is very frequently used in the forest. The most obvious example is making pegs and stakes. These are useful to hang a cooking pot, to strengthen your tent, to make a dryer for your boots, and so on. Scandi grind works very predictable here. The knife was created for woodworking. It's especially aggressive when plunging into the wood to the depth of its bevels. If it had a flat V grind going all the way up to the spine, it would start getting stuck in the wood at a certain point. But Scandi grind doesn't have this problem. It's just splitting the wood thanks to the flat part of the blade, the cheeks. The knife doesn't get stuck in the wood. The cutting edge keeps on cutting the fibers. The process is similar to batoning actually. But the pressure on the cutting edge is quite serious here. That's why the grade of steel comes into play, the quality of heat treating, bevel angles, and the craftsmanship of the knife maker. And the lance works about the same as with batoning. It's less aggressive in the initial stage of the cut, but when the knife gets deeper, wood fibers start tearing apart against the always changing geometry of the convex grind. At this point, the knife is neither cutting nor shaving, it's just destroying everything in its path. In addition, if you add some side pressure on the blade while chiseling, the knife will start tearing out chunks of wood, and you'll be definitely impressed with the power of convex grind. And the best part is that just like before, the pressure on the cutting edge will be much less than in any other kind of knife with different geometry. Now let's see how these knives deal with cooking. No matter how hardcore of a hiker you are, sometimes you want to take a bite. Speaking about using a knife for food procurement while hiking, the most common and the most stupid idea that comes to mind is opening a can of meat. Please, don't even think about it with a Scandi grind knife. Of course, a good knife made out of good steel will do it, but maybe the damage to the cutting edge won't even be fatal. But there's a big risk that you'll blunt your knife. After all, Scandi grind is all about the sharpest angle possible, and it's quite easy to damage it. A well-made knife with a convex grind will most likely not even notice opening a can of meat or even opening a crate of canned meat. Yes, the edge may get a little dull, but the probability of this is much smaller, and it will be very easy to recover the cutting properties. We'll talk about it more later on. Now, I also want to emphasize that a blunt convex grind won't cut at all, while a dull Scandi knife will cut even if it's totally dead, thanks to the geometry of its bevels. Food won't stick to the Scandi grind knife. The lens is also not very sticky, but with the Scandi grind, you'll have much less problems with cheese, for example. With hard foods, such as carrots or potatoes, Scandi grind gets the first prize for chopping, thanks to its aggressive entry into the material. But if you want to chop a potato in half, the Scandi knife will be betoning it. I'm sorry, but it's not a kitchen knife with a 1.5mm spine. You'll just cleave the potato. Truth be told, the lens is not much better in this regard. With such a thick spine, it will also tend to split hard foods. But with a convex grind, the maximum thickness is reached only at the spine, so it won't disfigure your item as much as a Scandi grind, where the maximum thickness of the blade starts right at the grind line, which comes at 1/3 of the blade. The main problem of the convex is that it's not aggressive enough in the initial stage of the cut. It doesn't matter whether you're cutting wood or food, Scandi wins hands down. But when the blade is already inside the material, the lens reveals itself in all its glory. In general, a knife with a convex geometry of the grind often makes an impression of a dull blade. Like I said, it's not so good at starting the cut, and even if you're playing with the blade in your open palm, it will be hard to cut yourself. That's because its cutting edge is almost a little rounded, while the Scandi grind boasts the sharpest cutting edge possible. At the same time, the lens cuts with the whole of its geometry, and that's why it's so good at maintaining the cutting edge. Knives with convex grind are considered the most resistant to severe stress loads, unlike the Scandi ones. You need to understand a Scandi ground knife. You need to know how to use it wisely, and then it will serve you for a very long time. Both the Scandi grind and the convex grind are very easy to maintain. The most elementary tools and scales will be enough to sharpen either of these knives, even in the wild. All you need to sharpen a Scandi grind is a whetstone with the grit size of your choice. That's it. Just put the blade bevel flush to the stone, lift it up a tiny bit, 1 degree is enough, and start grinding little by little on both sides. You need to raise your hand a little when you're coming close to the tip of the blade, because the angle there is usually a little different. Afterwards, you can polish the bevels a little, but it's not necessary. The knife will have an excellent cut even without it. And it's even easier to hone the convex grind. All you need in most cases is a small sharpening steel rod. Just put the blade on the rod and start shaving the rod with the knife, one side after another. don't make the angle too big, you need to feel it. It's similar to making thin shavings for kindling fire. You'll be surprised how quickly your knife starts having an excellent cut again. But please take into account that I'm only speaking about honing a knife, which means quickly recovering a dull cutting edge. But if your knife is heavily damaged, or God forbid, if its cutting edge is chipped, sharpening it will take much more effort, and you won't be able to do it in the field. Now that we're finished analyzing all the specifics of the Scandi grind and the Convex grind knives, let's summarize and choose the best knife for the forest. But, you know, I don't want to impose my opinion on you. I think now you've got enough information to make a balanced decision which knife is best for you in particular. Each kind of blade geometry will have its specifics that will be a benefit for some people and a disadvantage for others. A knife with a Scandi grind is made for woodworking. It has excellent control of the cut and it's unbelievably aggressive when entering the material. It can cleave, shave and cut wonderfully. And the Convex grind is a real off-roader. Yes, it's not as delicate and precise as the Scandi grind in many of the tasks. It's just created to destroy, and in destruction it's second to none. At the same time, it's quite good at preserving the cutting edge. Maybe that's the reason why hunters often choose a Convex grind as their main knife. Personally, I would say that the Scandi grind is a bushcrafting knife, and the Convex grind is a survival knife. Which blade geometry do you prefer the most? Let's discuss it in the comments. And of course, we'll be very happy if you subscribe to our channel, push the like button and share it with your friends. That's it, have a good one and see you online.